Now let's take a look at J66. And if you think back to how under the gun +1 is supposed to play this spot from a GTO point of view, they're actually supposed to check behind on this flop pretty frequently, even though they have a big range advantage, because they completely lack the nut advantage. And when you completely lack the nut advantage, you are supposed to check a decent chunk of the time. So this is a spot where if you look at the big blind's equity, it's very, very bad, right? However, there are some cards that are generally better for the big blind. Those are going to be cards that wrap around the 6, because that's going to give you additional open-ended straight draws and gut shot straight draws that you can conceivably bluff on the turn. You also clearly want to bet when you have a 6, right? Because you want to build the pot. Notice that the diamonds are worse across the board for the player in the big blind. That's because when the diamond comes, you no longer have any backdoor flush draws in your range that also jump up a little bit in equity. So this is a spot where under the gun +1 range is going to be very, very condensed in terms of a lot of ace highs, a lot of pairs, whereas the big blind just has a whole lot of junk plus a few super strong hands like a 6. So this is that scenario where you're going to be betting very infrequently, but when we do bet, we're going to be betting pretty big. So as we can see, betting infrequently across the board looks like about 25% of the time or so on most turn cards, and that's just because we are going to have some chunk of 6s in our range that would love to bet. So let's say the turn is the 8 of clubs. This is a reasonable turn card. Here we're going to want to bet with our best jacks and better, as well as many draws as we can conceivably find. So going through here, looks like I actually categorized these slightly wrong. These should all be clubs, my bad. All these draws here should be clubs, not hearts. This is a scenario where our range doesn't actually contain a ton of total junk, but when that 8 comes, that allows us to bet very frequently because we have lots of very obvious draws. And again, whenever we're betting with mostly very strong nut hands, we get to have lots of draws as well. Okay? So this is a spot where we get to bet reasonably often. I mean, when I say reasonably often, it's 35% of the time, 37% of the time. It's not a ton, but it is still pretty often. And we are going to be bluffing here with our open-ended straight draws, our flush draws. Again, these should be clubs. I apologize. I'm checking some of these hands to check and then call, like ace highs. King highs with clubs can easily check call. We're betting over cards, king, queen, right? Queen 10, queen 9. These are gut shots. They get to bet. 10-9's an open-ended straight draw. 5-4 is a gut shot, but it's really bad. You're going to find that the worst gut shots usually just don't even try. So this looks all pretty self-explanatory, right? We go through, we categorize the range. This all looks really, really nice, and seems like a nice, reasonable way to play this scenario. So solver bets 25% of the time. Remember, it bets 25% in most scenarios, so a little bit less than me. What it's doing differently is, as you see, it's checking some 6s, which is kind of neat to see. It's also checking some flush draws. So given it checks some 6s, it can't bet all of its flush draws, so that's why it makes logical sense to check some flush draws. Notice like 5-4 does not bet. Does 9-7 bet? It does. Does 10-9 bet? It does. Does queen 10 bet? It does. Does king queen bet? It does. Okay, so good. So it's good to go through and just like check all of your draws to see if they're at least somewhere within reason, right? And again, I'm using the generally simplified strategy of checking the best flush draws, betting the weaker ones. I think that's probably a good play against most people. But solver does not do that. As you see, the solver bets the weaker flush draws. I'm sorry, checks the weaker flush draws and bets the bigger ones. Let's take a look at this ace turn. It's an interesting turn. It naturally would make sense to me that the ace is not particularly great for you, but this is actually one of the cards the solver bets a little bit more often on. Probably that's because when your opponent does have an ace, they're just not going to fold. So this is a situation where we're betting our 6s again, right? Makes logical sense. Betting ace-jack, that's a really good hand. So in turn, we can't have quite as many bluffs as the previous scenario because we had 16% nut hands on this board because the jack was very, very strong. On this board, though, the jack is not as strong, right? It's a very clear marginal mate hand. So I'm just going to go through and select all the flush draws. Notice we have no straight draws besides king 10, queen 10, and king queen. King queen could conceivably win at the showdown, though. I suppose if I wanted to pick additional bluffs, I guess that's the hand to use. We're checking some flush draws here, clearly. Maybe we're supposed to check a few more flush draws. I could get behind checking some queens here. But this all seems like a good, strong, reasonable strategy to me. Notice we're check folding more often. That's because this turn is not as good for me, right? Remember on the 8 turn, I have a lot of draws that very much want to bluff. Whereas on this turn, I have way more junk because a lot of those hands that would have been draws if 8 comes have become either, well, they've all become junk. They're no longer marginal made hands or draws here, right? So we have to check, at least using this strategy a little bit more often. Solver does roughly the same thing again, right? Betting ace-jack and better, bets all the sixes, or the majority of the sixes. King-queen does decide to bluff some portion of the time, but notice king-queen, king-10, and queen-10 are all using a mixed strategy. I notice here a lot of flush draws are betting now, which makes sense because there are fewer, like, very clearly obvious bluffs available, like obvious draws. So when there are no obvious draws, you probably should just pick the flush draws to bet.